So now we've got, just look at the top and let me know if it seems correct.
Yeah, okay, I see them all now.
And I'll refresh.
We've actually done this before, Tanner. Can you believe that?
Yeah. And feel free to retweet and like our streams on X on YouTube.
Right. Okay. Should we get started?
Just a second. Let me just retweet it so that it's there. And also on Blue Sky, because now you need to do everything twice. Just a second and I'll be ready. Where is it? Where is that live? Oh, here it is. Okay, from my perspective, we can start.
All right. Here we go.
Wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. Why is Tanner? Okay. Okay, here's Tanner's. Tanner, you're back. Okay, now you can start.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting episode of JavaScript Jabber. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio and the voice for being in mind, but you're stuck with me as your host. Today with me on our panel, we have Mr. Dan Shapir. How you doing, Dan?
I'm fine. Hello from Tel Aviv.
Where it's probably really warm, right?
Oh, not super warm, but nice. You know, you can wear a t-shirt outside if you like.
Right. Yeah, I was just, I'll diverge a little bit here. I was just in Thailand. Been gone for a couple weeks, was visiting my daughter there. And in Thailand, it's really, really warm. It barely gets below 70 Fahrenheit during the year, even at the lowest point in the year. And on the way there, so I dressed for Thailand, right? Took clothes for Thailand. Well, on the way there, we got delayed in 24 hours in Seoul, Korea. And to say it was cold is an understatement of the year. We went from, when we left Seoul and went to Chiang Mai, we went from 22 Fahrenheit to 22 Celsius because it was like below zero cold. It was so cold. We tried to go for a walk one day and lasted about 3 minutes and said, okay, we're going back inside. So, but yeah, Chiang Mai was awesome because we had, it was like in the 80s Fahrenheit, you know, no humidity. This is the coolest time of the year, coolest in terms of temperature, not because I was there, but yeah, it was perfect weather. And then I came back from wearing shorts and no coat all week to bundling up and having multiple blankets on the bed.
So Tel Aviv is not in the 80s, but it's in the high 60s, low 70s.
That's still pretty nice.
During the day.
Yeah, that's nice.
At night it gets a bit colder.
And then also on our panel, we have Mr. AJ. How you doing, AJ?
Yo, coming at you live from the
Purple
shed.
Room.
Oh, it's better than the alternative.
Yes, coming at you dead. Yes, I agree. So, and our very special guest today is Mr. Tanner Linsley of TanStack fame. How you doing, Tanner?
I'm doing great.
I'm very excited.
Good to be here.
All right, it's good to have you back. We have had Tanner here in the past on JavaScript Jabber on episode, what was it, Dan? I forgot the number.
Oh, I think it was episode 578.
578, talking about the TanStack. And for those of you who might be wondering, this was a question I asked on the previous episode. It is not called TanStack because he is tan, because if you look at him, he is obviously not very tan like me. It is tan because of Tanner. So for those of you, unlike me, who made that logical jump, good for you, but some of us aren't that smart. Anyway, so we are here today to talk about, actually, before we get into start, let's just give a brief description of what the TanStack is, overview for those who might not have heard of it before.
You guys are going to give that, right? Not me.
Yeah, sure. Let me pull up the About Us page.
I'll do it.
And
you'll do it. Thank you.
So
I can do it if you want to, but I prefer you do it.
I got it. I'm just playing with you. No, so I started TanStack as like an open source GitHub organization a couple of years ago to start collecting all of my libraries that I was building. It started with React Table and then React Query. And we took both of those agnostic, so they became something that I didn't want to have to like brand, every framework times every library that I had. So I decided to call it TanStack. And so I pulled all those libraries together, and then we kept building. So now there's a virtualization library called TanStack Virtual. We have some libraries that are for like helping you build open source packages. We have our own store now, our reactive store.
Oh, that's cool.
TanStack Form is an agnostic headless form library, which is pretty sweet. It's almost 1.0, which is pretty cool.
What is that? Is that like a form rendering library where you provide the underlying structure and it renders the form, or what exactly? How does that work?
So it's more around just like the state management, the validation, and the form life cycles for forms, like for doing client side and full stack forms. But it's headless, so when it comes time to render those forms, you attach the form logic to whatever you want, whether it's like a component library or just a raw input, something like that. So it gives you full control over your UI, but gives you all of the nice logic and validation and management of the form state that you would expect.
That's cool.
Yeah. Corbin Crutchley is the one who's kind of heading that up. We combined our libraries together. He was building, I can't remember when he was built. It's been a while. It's been about 2 years, but he was building a form library that was supposed to kind of be the next version of Formic, but it was React only. And then I was building one that was really, really type safe and agnostic. So we put them together, and that became TanStack Form.
Yes, according to the description, it helps you, quote, stop crying over your forms. So obviously, obviously you have experience in working with forms.
I don't cry too much, but if there's something that would make me cry, it would be building forms. Yeah.
By the way, are you familiar with the VEST form validator?
The what validator? Sorry.
VEST.
No, I'm not.
We actually had the creator on, Evyatar. He works at Meta, but it's his own project. It's interesting in that it does form validation in a way that looks very much like unit testing.
Interesting. Yeah, I would love to look at it. That sounds cool.
So it's called VEST.
Okay.
Needless to say, you hear this coming, very invested in it. Sorry, that was just hanging out there. I had to grab that one.
Oh yeah, like a matzo ball. So form is kind of another one we're working on, and then obviously a year ago we did 1.0 for TanStack Router, which I'd been working on for several years before that as well, and now we're here to talk about Start, which is
so before we go there, I noticed that you have a few more things on the TanStack site. You've got TanStack Ranger. What is that?
Ranger is it's not used as much in my opinion. It's a fun little library from my past, but you can use it to create multi-range sliders. So if you ever use the range element, you've got that single slider. We needed some that had both handles that you'll kind of see for range slider selectors, and then we even had some that would create steps. So we'd have like 3 or 4 different handles on an individual range input, and you'd be able to kind of create different steps using different handles. So it's a headless library to create those. We wanted it to have a very custom UI. I don't use it as much anymore, admittedly, but it's still a pretty cool library.
And also TanStack config.
Yeah, the config is what we use for publishing all of our libraries. So it helps us both build all of the different versions like ESM and CommonJS, like legacy and modern versions. And it helps us publish those to TanStack to NPM using kind of our, it's based on Angular semantic versioning but basically lets us do all of our PR automation for releasing new versions and whatnot.
Cool. Okay, so now back to TanStack Start.
So Start is I'm going to be honest, it's like 90% of Start is just TanStack router. Because routers are frameworks. There's not really any way around that. But I decided to build the router first as just like a client side router that would have some SSR utilities on top of it. But then trying to put together your own SSR environment really sucks, which is why like meta frameworks, as we call them, exist. So TanStack Start is like the official implementation of getting server features into a TanStack router application. That mostly includes, so you get SSR, which is the very first thing, which most people want. It gives you streaming on top of that as well. So all the new streaming, APIs that React has for suspense and just being able to stream data down in responses in general. And then it gives you bundling for both, like for all the environments. So it bundles the client side, the server side, and it also bundles for server functions, which is, it's our version of being able to access, all of the server features that you would expect. But so that's where it gets a little interesting. I think we could discuss that a little bit more, but server functions are really cool.
Before we get to server functions, which
Yeah.
I will definitely want to discuss, RPCs is a
Yeah.
favorite topic of mine, and I actually had an episode on JavaScript Jabber when I spoke about RPCs.
Awesome.
I don't remember the number off the top of my head.
What about offhand? I always check both places.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's worth mentioning though, because I think we kind of skipped it, that all of your libraries, utilities, frameworks, whatever, they're all built on top of React, right? There's nothing like you haven't implemented your own view framework or whatever it's supposed to be called.
No, they're not built on top of React. We have React adapters for all of them. So every single one of these libraries is in fact called TanStack something because it's no longer just React. So for instance, the TanStack query has adapters for React and Vue and Svelte and Solid. TanStack Virtual has adapters for all of those, and so does TanStack Form and Table. TanStack Router is the only one that is currently React only. And that's mostly just for our own sanity's sake right now. Basically because we just wanted to get all the way finished from 0 to 1.0 on one framework. We're still preparing the code base and writing it to be agnostic, but we're just not trying to do too much at once.
You think it's really doable? I think I spoke with Ryan Carniato a while back where he told me that I think it might have been him. Maybe I'm confusing him with somebody else, but
No,
I
it's
think
probably
it
him.
was probably him. And he probably said something along the lines that he came to the conclusion that writing a true multi-framework router is bordering on impossible or something.
I've recently changed his mind. So
Okay.
he had some concerns, and so did I, honestly. And we got together and we've been talking for, years. We go back a long time, and we've been chatting a lot about this. And recently he's like, oh, you know what? With our new Solid 2.0 stuff they're working on and the new async data primitives, there's really no concerns anymore. It's just opinions on top of routing and life cycles for navigation. So really what we're going to do is, actually, I'll let you in on some fun news. So it's something official, and it might never become something official, but behind the scenes, so the TanStack Start and the Solid Start team, we're working very, very closely now on a lot of things. So mainly one is that TanStack Start and Solid have both been based on Vinci up to this point, which is awesome. It helped us get to where we are today. But to better consume Nitro and to even further align our architectures, we are moving away from Vinci to just a unified layer for Start, essentially. And it's just going to have some server function plugins, a Nitro coordinator, and that's going to set the stage for TanStack router for Solid. So Solid router, and that's
That's
not
really cool.
that is a semi-active development. We have some people who are, we're separating some of the utilities. We're making sure that, we're not mixing up framework types and getting ready to build these adapters. But essentially, there's nothing blocking us now. If I wanted to divert all my attention to Solid router and Solid, getting that working in Solid, I could do that today. But I'm not going to do that till we get the React one done.
So, question about that. You threw out a whole bunch of project names, some of which I'm familiar with, some of which less so. Vinci, Nitro. Also, as I recall, Vinci is built on Vite.
Yeah,
So, can you tell us a little bit about all these projects?
I would love to. So let's start at the bottom level. So all of this is based on Vite. We're 100% bought into the Vite ecosystem. I believe it's the future. So we wouldn't be able to do any of this without Vite. And at the end of the day, a lot of this boils down to just Vite and Vite plugins. And some of it is going to use the new Vite 6 environment APIs, and some of it we can just do today already just by building multiple environments ourselves. So then on top of Vite, there's Nitro. So Nitro is this toolkit that it uses Vite, but it helps you build your backend code to work basically anywhere you want to deploy it. So you can use Nitro as this unified layer. Nitro is by the Un.js team. And it has this unified layer for pretty much everything you'd want to do on the back end. You can write your code mostly one way and deploy it to basically anywhere that they maintain an adapter for, and it will just work.
So they handle the deployment part of building a framework / meta framework for you, because that's obviously a big challenge, having to deploy to all the different platforms.
Well, like, to put it into perspective, so like Next.js and Remix, they have to maintain their own adapters to build their projects into the right formats for all these different deployment destinations. Nitro does that. That's Nitro's job. And so if you just use Nitro, you don't have to worry about that and duplicate all that effort. You just get to use what Nitro has built. So literally for me, I recently migrated a site from Vercel over to Netlify. And it was literally the difference of me going into my config and saying deployment, I think deployment preset, I think is what it's called. I just changed it. It's a string. I just changed it from Vercel to Netlify. And when I rebuilt it, it just rebuilt everything for Netlify instead. I didn't have to change anything.
And it also assumes supports AWS, Cloudflare, whatever, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And so Nitro is built on top of Vite, and they're upgrading to the new Vite APIs as well. So it's the clearest path for no duplicated effort really whatsoever. Is they're going to maintain these adapters, and we're going to use Nitro directly, and you get to use the Nitro APIs in your apps as well. So they have wonderful products like Unstorage, where you just kind of have this unified storage API, and you supply the drivers. And that driver may map to, one type of memory on this host, or you could map it to another one. If you're using Cloudflare, you could map it to D1 or something like that. So they have a really great abstraction for all of these different implementations of features that we like to use on servers.
I'm curious, aside from you guys, you and Ryan, and Who else is using them? For what
Uh,
project?
it actually came out of the Vue and the Nuxt ecosystem. So Nuxt is built on top of UnJS, essentially, like all of it. And that's what they use. So UnJS and Nitro is kind of like the lower level server toolkit and the primitives that came out of the Nuxt project.
I was wondering if there was a relationship, because I remember talking with Daniel Rowe about Nitro when that first came in, when they first started using that, and the speed increase was supposedly really phenomenal.
And you know who else uses it is Brandon, who built Analog JS. So it's kind of the same approach. Like, hey, let's build a framework that uses Nitro but for Angular. So he built his own Angular meta framework, and it uses Nitro under the hood. Very, very cool. That's how powerful and portable it is.
So it's really interesting that Vite came out of Vue and now Nitro came out of Vue. So Vue is contributing a lot to the framework space way beyond Vue itself.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things about Nuxt that have been pushing forward what we've been able to do outside of like Nuxt itself. It's pretty sweet. So Vinci is built by Nikhil Saraf, and Nikhil was working on the Solid team for a little while. I think he still is technically started the part of the Solid team, but before Vite 6 came out, there wasn't really a way for you to do kind of a unified, hey, I'm building a full stack application, like a unified config. You would have to have had like one Vite configuration and build setup for your client, and then you'd have to have another setup with Nitro or something else for your backend, and you kind of merge those together. Or you end up building something like that on your own, like Remix has done. But Nikhil wanted kind of this unified layer, and we also needed to do some multi-environment things before Vite 6 came out. So he built Vinci, Vinxi, and Vinci is essentially a wrapper around that experience. So it uses Nitro directly and Vite directly to coordinate this full stack dev and prod build experience. And it was phenomenal. Like it helped me get off the ground really quickly and just start focusing on building like the runtime and my framework APIs. Now that we're getting closer to 1.0 for TanStack Start, I want more control over what we're doing with Nitro and what we're doing with Vite. And Nikhil's also just very busy with other things. In my opinion, more important things for him. And that's totally fine. So Ryan and I have decided that we're going to kind of slowly start to supplant this Vinci logic with just a shared layer that we use between all the Start projects.
Implemented in what, by the way?
Well, sorry, what do you mean?
What are you? Well, of course, I assume it's Java, well, TypeScript, but like, what libraries are you using there? Is it like based on signals because it's Ryan, or?
No, so this layer is mostly going to be a collection of Vite plugins that are very configurable, and they'll use Babel under the hood. And really, it will all come together in hopefully what is going to be a very thin layer on top of Nitro. So essentially just feeding Nitro a unified config to say, here's what I want you to build for my server environment, for my SSR environment, and for my client environment. The bundles particularly. And to kind of make all of that cohesive. Yeah, it'll just be TypeScript. At the end of the day, what I would like to have it be is just a Vite plugin itself, which kind of sounds weird. It's a Vite plugin that would call into Nitro to produce many different environments and build even more Vite bundles. So, but I think that's the beautiful part about it, is that if we can boil it down to just Vite plugins, I think it's going to be really powerful.
And that's basically going to be like under some sort of a start moniker.
Yeah, most likely. We'll probably just share internal packages privately for now, and each one of us will just export our own builders for it. So you'll still, you'll probably build something like create TanStack start Vite will be like one of our packages, and you'll call that function, and it will produce all the Vite plugins that you need to add to your build, essentially.
And
They'll have
by
their
the
own.
way, one thing that you said before, that the 10 stack router was 90% of the way towards 10 stack start in terms of
Yeah.
being a framework. I think Ryan Florence more or less said the same thing about Remix and React router. I think they even kind of merged the two projects together for that reason.
Yeah, I wish that maybe that had been recognized sooner so that they didn't have to go through kind of the snip snap kind of a pattern, because it's always been apparent that the router is what drives much of what you do. That's where all of the opinions are, and where you're feeding, it's calling into your code and scheduling its own things and doing its own thing. So it very much is the framework. um I Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say there, other than I just wish that they had maybe it would have been better for their branding, I think, if they hadn't have done like, oh, it's Remix, and then they took React Router and put it into Remix, and now it's React Router and putting Remix back in there. It's very confusing. It should have just been incremental from the beginning. They should have just built Remix as an add-on to React Router. But I don't know. Everybody has their reasons.
Well, the reasons, and also, like you said, people realize things as they built them.
Yeah. And that was merely an idea that I had. I just wanted to build my own router, and I knew that I wanted it to be client side only, and that server side features were going to come later. I'm very, very grateful that they were willing to go guinea pig that process and probably find out the hard way that it should have just been React Router all along. So I'm not complaining. They've done me a great favor in research, and yeah.
By the way, I'm curious, do you think that maybe routing, client-side routing, I mean, should have been part of the platform in some way?
Which platform? Like the web platform?
Yeah, like DOM APIs for client-side routing beyond the basic history
Mm,
APIs. Or
I don't know. I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, that would be great, but where would those opinions come from that would serve everyone? I don't know. Because even for projects that look a lot alike, even for like React Router and TanStack Router, like I took good ideas from React Router. I took the loader pattern, and a couple of other patterns that I just thought, what, these guys really nailed these APIs. And then for other things, I just did things completely different.
so can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Can you elaborate a little bit about what is the loader pattern, and also about some of the things that you've done differently?
For sure. So the loader pattern is just a really fancy way of saying like life cycle management for navigation. Basically, you click a link and we know, hey, you're about to go to this next page. And before you even navigate, before we try and render, before we do anything about showing the next content, you have life cycle methods that will fire. This goes way, way back, even to like Knockout and older frameworks that were just like, oh yeah, they're about to navigate to this new page. Here's a function that you can run before that happens, and potentially do some asynchronous work. So that concept, that's the core concept. And then the loader pattern is just applying that lifecycle method to data loading specifically, to say, before we navigate to this route, we need to make sure that we have this data. So when you hear people talk about loaders, that's generally what they're talking about. It's just a lifecycle method to ensure that data is present.
By asynchronous, by the way, in this context, you mean it's asynchronous to the operation of the browser, but it's not asynchronous to the actual navigation. I mean, you do need the data in order to display the quote unquote new page.
Right. Yeah, you might, and again, here's another reason why it doesn't really work to just have some universal web standard is some frameworks will even wait to change the URL before, like, until the data is loaded. And for me, for instance, I like as soon as they navigate, the URL changes synchronously, and then the side effect of rendering what the user wants to see is asynchronous. So yeah, there's lots of opinions there.
Interesting. So that's what is similar about what you've done in React Router. Can you talk a little bit about what is different? Because I also think that informs some of the differences between
Absolutely.
TanStack and other frameworks.
Yeah. So yeah, they both have loaders. They both support. I mean, let's not even limit it to Remix, but let's just say like modern routers. Kind of the expectations for all modern routers is that they have nested routing, the ability to like nest route matching segments inside of each other to do shared layouts.
So I apologize for interrupting you. Just to clarify, nested
Yeah.
routing means that you click a link and you go into, let's say, call it a sub page or sub resource in a sense, or like, and part of the page stays the same and then part of the page changes, or is that something else and I'm explaining it wrong?
No, that's exactly right, and it's the difference of it's just encapsulation and reuse is what it is. You could write your entire router as a flat map to say this exact URL matches this exact component. And if you have components that share the same layout, like a nav bar or a sidebar, and this is back like with older versions of Next.js, you would have to render that nav bar and sidebar on every single page that you wanted it to be on, right? And that has implications depending on the framework you're using, that sometimes those components would unmount and remount, even though they look like they're still there, they haven't changed.
And
So
then they lose state.
What's that?
And then they lose state.
Yeah, that's one of the things too. Hang on, just.
Oh, we'll edit this out.
Sorry,
No
there's
problem.
somebody at my door, and I have no idea who it is. So,
no, if you need to go check, then no problem. We can edit this part out. Steve, we can hear you clicking, by the way.
Oh, good. You want me to click harder?
No, as long as we're having this part that we need to edit, I might as well tell you. It's interesting to see all these patterns that existed in backend routing being recreated or solved on client-side routing in different ways.
Oh, just door-to-door sales, ignoring no solicitation signs. So pretty standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
very
and
fun.
we'll finish. So to the person who edits, this is where we resume. Go for it.
All right. So, yeah, there's lots of these shared things. Nested routing is one of those things, but instead of having this flat list of URLs to components, you get to share those URL routes. So say you have an admin/admin, right? You might have a lot of sub pages on that /admin/users or whatever. And instead of having to render like the admin sidebar for every single one of those sub pages, you just render it once in the admin layout component. And then every single sub admin page below that will get inserted into that layout wherever you render an outlet or render children, essentially.
So you have this sort of a slot where the sub page is slotted in.
Yep. And that slot works for index pages, which means, hey, we didn't match anything, so we're just on the index, and you can slot something in there, or you can slot in subpages.
Cool.
Yeah, so nested routing is a big one. That was kind of that's one where React Router really nailed it. Next.js didn't have that for a while, and it was really enraging. And React Router has had that for a long time. When Next.js finally added that, it was like, oh wow, this is wonderful. And it's like, yeah, why didn't you do that sooner? And that was a no-brainer for us. It's like, yeah, we're going to support that. We're going to do nested routes. Things like file-based routing, where you can create that tree using a file structure just to kind of have maintenance be nice, and have some opinions and convention around just moving quickly. Loaders we talked about. Kind of just your basic navigation APIs, being able to have links and imperative navigate calls to kind of move around your app. All that stuff is pretty much the same. Where it starts to get different from both Next.js and Remix is so TanStack Router basically I rewrote it from the ground up with type safety at the forefront. So every single decision that I made when I rewrote this router was so that we could have 100% inferred type safety. Essentially, the goal was, I don't want to have to write TypeScript syntax in my routing, but I want it all to be extremely type safe. So,
Type safe means that if I put in an invalid route, I get red squigglies. Is that what type safe means in this context?
yeah, it means a lot of things. That's one of them, and that's what I like to call that is the basic level 1 type safety that I would expect out of a router. Is that, yeah, you don't let me navigate statically, warn me that, hey, you're trying to navigate somewhere that doesn't exist. That's just the basic bare bones. There's a lot more to it, though. I don't know how much you want to go into that, but
I think we talked about it actually in the last time you were here, so I don't want to go too deep because I want to talk about the TanStack framework,
right.
and some of the RPC work is really interesting for me.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that too.
So just in a few words, just to mention it, as I recall, it's also type safety about URL parameters, so you can specify the type of a URL parameter, and the value has to match that type.
Right. And that applies to a lot of different areas of the API. So search params is a big piece of TanStack Router. All of our search parameters are validated and type safe, and have first class APIs built in to manage search parameters like you would use state, essentially, like you're just managing state. That's a really big difference, and something that really not many other routers, if any, that I know of have. That's a big reason of why I wrote it as well. On top of that, there's type safety throughout all of the other APIs that we have in there. So there's things like route context and middleware. All of that stuff is type safe as well. There's the configuration itself, like being able to use loader data inside of your components, or use data from other routes from different files. It's all type safe. It all works. It's all very magical. I don't know what else to say there other than you should try it, because you're probably missing out if you haven't tried it yet.
Let me put it this way. We are starting a new project. I basically made it part of our standard starter kit at Sisense. So, we might, if it's a project that needs a full framework, like we might debate between, let's say, Next.js or something else. But if it's a project that's mostly going to be client-side rendered, then I've made TanStack like part of our standard config.
I would agree. All right. So before we move on to start, there's one more thing I want to mention. So TanStack Router has caching built into it, which is like a really, really lightweight version of React Query or TanStack Query built right into the router. So for simple use cases, you may not even need TanStack Query. You just load the data you need in your routes, and it's managed for you there. And you have things like stale time, SWR, background refetching. It's all just built into the router. So that's very important. A very important distinction. And yeah, just generally managing state in the URL. If you're going to use search parameters, like at all, if you're going to use search parameters, you should use TanStack routing.
Oh, I love it when as many as possible configuration values are in the URL. So, for example, I use Grafana. I've even spoken about it here on JavaScript Jabber. And one of the things I love about Grafana is that most of their configurations are URL parameters, which makes it very easy to share graphs.
Yep. More state should be in the URL. Not all state, but more of our state should be in the URL. And as soon as you want to start doing that, you'll realize that the tools you have at your disposal are not that great. So come use TanStack Router and you'll be much happier.
Okay, then. TanStack, the framework. TanStack Start.
TanStack Start. Yep. So I wasn't planning on building it initially.
You know what? I'm not surprised. I mean, one person kind of taking on the whole Next.js ecosystem in a sense.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. I wasn't planning on building it initially because one, I didn't need it personally, so just building a lot of SPAs. But I'll be honest, I nerd sniped myself on this one really, really bad. So I had this idea about basically a year ago, and I was like, you know what? I wonder if I could rewrite tanstack.com and migrate it from Remix to just use TanStack Router with a custom SSR setup. And I did that. And it was really hard. And I was like, man, that was really
By the
tough.
way, as an aside, when I worked at Wix, I used to work at Wix up to about 5 years ago. Time flies. 4
Wow.
5. Yeah, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that. Wix actually, when I was there, we built our own SSR framework platform, and we did it first of all because none existed at the time. We predated Next.js, I think. Also, the use case was very different. I mean, hosting millions of websites on one
I
platform
imagine.
is a different, use case. So I know for a fact how difficult that can be. It was
Yeah,
very challenging to do it efficiently and
it's
effectively.
enraging a lot of the time, to be honest, because I mean, the first thing you're going to realize is now you have hydration problems. Anytime you're trying to do SSR with React, you just have to get really strict about hydration. But yeah, it was difficult, and that's kind of what started TanStack Start. Is I was like, okay, I just did this manually, and it really, really sucked. How can I make that better? And I started talking to Ryan Carniato, and I was like, hey, what are you using for Solid Start? And he said, well, I'm using Vinci to kind of put all this together to make my life a little easier. And I tried Vinci out, and I just kind of, again, just built it manually, but using Vinci, and it made my life easier. And so you could see it's just a snowball at that point. Then I decided, you know what, this is going to be pretty cool. And I showed it to some people that I trusted, and they said, this is amazing. But I really wish it had server like server loaders. How do I only do something on the server? And because in Remix you have server side loaders, and even in Next.js pages router you have get server side props and stuff like that. And so I was like, okay, so it's not really complete yet. How can I make this better? And that's when I started diving into server functions. And initially those were implemented with Vinci, but designing a proper API around server function RPCs has been like my last 6 months of work.
So let's talk a little bit about RPC, because apparently it's a subject that's close to your heart, and I know for a fact that it's close to mine. As I mentioned, we even had an episode about it. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, about what is RPC?
Yeah, pretty sure it stands for remote procedure call, right? Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely correct. And
Good.
by the way, I used RPCs, by the way, as an aside, back in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Nothing
Yeah, they go
nothing to
back
do
a
with
long
web
time.
technologies. Yeah, things like Corba or DCOM.
Hmm. Yeah, they have a really like rich history in computer programming, and I've read a little bit about that. Ryan Carniato sent me some stuff about them as well, and I love when we can like find old tech and make it feel new and great. But this is one of those things where it's like, yeah, we've been doing this for a really long time. But the idea behind the RPC is that you get to create this function in a very generic sense, talking about RPCs, this function that can be called remotely. And when it's called remotely, it has, an underlying protocol implementation and messaging implementation that sends those messages back and forth. But it creates a very opaque interaction where you can just say, I need to call this function. It may happen on your machine or it may happen on another machine, right? But it's a remote procedure call. It's going to happen remotely. And it feels very different than calling into, say, a REST API or GraphQL or something like that.
Well,
Just
yes and no, because
similarities and
talk,
differences. Yeah.
yeah, because
Let's talk about them.
putting aside GraphQL for a second.
Yeah.
If we're talking about RESTful APIs to some extent, they're request response, which is the basic prerequisite for something that looks like a function.
Yeah.
That you send a message and you wait until you get a response,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. And GraphQL even has a little bit of RPC vibes in it as well, where you can and do kind of create these functions that you call through the GraphQL like syntax and protocol, right? So RPC is kind of in a lot of different things, and we even kind of implicitly create RPCs in REST environments all the time as well. You have a REST API, and you just kind of need this one-off, like, hey, / generate whatever, and you call it, and it's going to do something, and it's going to come back. I think in our modern definition of RPCs, though, I think a lot of it comes down to how you compose that logic, right? Because generally when we're talking about GraphQL procedures and functions and HTTP, like REST APIs, these are APIs that you kind of have to design in separate places. You say, okay, I'm building an API, I'm building a GraphQL endpoint, and I'm going to build this function in this place. And then in a completely separate location, either whether it's in your mono repo or a completely separate application, you're then constructing a way to call into that function through, URL schema or GraphQL client that's been generated or something like that. So you creating that function and authoring that function and calling it are seemingly very separate places. With an RPC, at least in our modern,
Often, by the way, implemented by separate people. It might be the
yeah,
backend team that's creating the RESTful endpoints, and then the front end teams that are putting some sort of facade on top of them.
and possibly in separate languages too, right?
Usually, often in separate languages.
Yeah, often. And so RPCs, at least the modern way we're thinking about RPCs, is more, it's more of like an integrated approach to creating that messaging layer. So for anybody listening who could imagine I'm just going to tell you how we do it in TanStack Start. But
Go for it.
basically, in any file you want in your application, you can call a function called create server function. And you pass that call a function. And everything inside of that function is going to only run on the server.
Even only exist on the server.
It's only going to exist on the server. So like when we bundle your application, we literally take that function that's inside of there and we strip it away from the client. And what we do is we replace it with a fetch call. It's a fetch to to an HTTP endpoint
It
with
used
the
to be called
function.
the stub in the old RPC days.
Yeah, a stub, right? You stub it, and we implement that stub with fetch and with an HTTP endpoint, and then we extract that function into the server bundle. And on the server, we're listening to that same endpoint for that stub, for that fetch call. And when we receive that call, we take the request and we pipe it through to the function that we extracted. And so they execute in completely different environments, but you author them in a full stack way. So I mean, these functions can live right next to a React component that renders on the client. And they could even live next to things that are client only in the same file.
I think that's kind of the key. I
Yeah.
think that three things enabled RPC for the modern web, because RPCs existed on the back end like forever. So you
Yeah.
obviously, I mentioned the old technologies like Corba and DCOM. Now you have gRPC. So all this stuff on the back end has always been there. On the web, I think three things that happened in recent years, let's call it this way, kind of enabled it. So one was the full stack frameworks,
Yep.
because you needed to be able to write code that builds or compiles to both sides for this mechanism to be truly seamless. And you kind of said it. It's intended for the full stack scenario.
Yep.
So that's number one. Another one is TypeScript. Without typing, this whole thing would have been moot, because you need to be able to specify the types of parameters that you're sending over the wire. Now, you could have done it explicitly using something that kind of looks like Zod or something, but it would have been really uncomfortable. Or the old component props that we used to have in React. It would have been really uncomfortable to do it that way. And the third thing that, in my opinion, and I wonder if you agree, that kind of enabled it is a sync await. The fact that you can call a function and have it execute asynchronously, but with the function called semantics.
Yeah, I don't know about the third. I feel like it definitely helps. It definitely helps. We could have done it with callback functions. It wouldn't have been fun.
Yeah, it would have been fun, and it would have broken the function called semantics. I mean,
Yeah.
One of the big things about RPC is that it feels like a function call, and
Yeah.
and when it doesn't, then you're missing out on most of the fun.
Yeah, I would agree. It definitely, async await elevates the experience to more of the traditional RPC feel. That definitely.
But how do you do that in React client side? I mean, you can't really do a sync await in client side React.
No, I mean, they would like to make you think that you can with the new use API. But I mean, it's not really intended for like end user usage. So again, that kind of falls back to like, that's why I built TanStack query, is because React lacked, and honestly to this day still lacks, a really well vetted, good client side asynchronous primitive. And maybe they don't add it because React query is there and it's good enough, or they don't, or they just decided to skip it. But really, if you ask somebody today from React purist land or core land, they'll say, oh, well, you're just supposed to use server components for data fetching, and just pass promises, and then you call the use or whatever. To that, I say that's making big assumptions about the way you're authoring your application. So, yeah.
Well, to be fair, it's part of their vision of the um, how do they call it, the unidirectional data flow. That RPC kind of somewhat breaks that in a sense, because with the unidirectional data flow model, you've got the data flowing down as props, and you've got interactions flowing up as, let's say, server actions. I don't know. Do they still call it server actions, or do they also call it server functions now?
Yeah, they call it server functions, which is kind of annoying, but that's fine.
Yeah,
Um,
it's functions that are not supposed to return a value though.
yeah. And see, that's where things differ for me. I don't really think it breaks the React methodology. And most of that just comes down to how you're handling the responses, in my opinion. But for RPCs that just aren't doing anything, I mean, look at the way Next.js handles server functions right now. You call a server function, and they basically just invalidate everything. They call back into the root on the server, and they kind of re-render your whole app. Now there's
Again,
ways,
you need directional data flow. The events flow bubble up, the data
right?
flows down.
It's just really not great for performance, though. Especially the way that React is even designed. It's kind of sucks to re-render your entire application from the top down.
Let's put it this way. It's not surprising that you created React Query rather than they.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I really like React, and I like the syntax. I like the framework. It's really wonderful. If I had a magic wand that I could wave, it would be that that we just use solid. But that's not going to happen. So for now, I have to ride on the shoulders of this giant that is React, and that's fine. Because it's really good, and it's good enough, and it's decent to work in.
And nobody
So,
got fired for using React.
no, exactly. But that kind of goes back to the way that we're trying to build things with TanStack libraries, is that it shouldn't matter really where you go. We just want to build great core functionality and bring it to all the frameworks. And yeah, I worry a little bit about React's future with pushing server components so much, because it's a wonderful technology that is kind of derailing a lot of people. And from where I'm standing, it's very confusing for a lot of people. It's very difficult to implement as a framework, and it comes with a lot of new rules and overhead that just don't really apply to, I'm going to call it, the more traditional way of building an SSR application that's just isomorphic and fully hydrated.
So I'll derail us a little bit because I do want to talk a little bit about that. So I've been looking at some statistics about React usage and Meta framework usage. For those who don't know, more people are using React than all the other Vue frameworks put together. So React is number one, Vue is number two, but Vue is less than half of React, and everything else is less than the remaining part.
Those stats are wrong. I know it. I can feel it.
And in React land, approximately almost 20% are using Next.js. And the rest are not. They're not using any Meta framework. But if you look at new websites, it seems that almost all of them are being built using Next.js. So any project, there's a good chance that any project older than 2 or 3 years that started 2 or 3 years ago is probably not using Next.js and may never use Next.js. But any project that's being started right now, there's a good chance that they're using Next.js.
I think that's a fair assumption.
The interesting question, though, when they're using Next.js, are they also using server components? And that I have no way to know. And I'm kind of curious about that. Like, what is the buy-in for server components?
I don't know if it's easy to know the buy-in. I mean, we could go back and look. I've done tons of polls. I mean, it's obviously biased off of my audience, but I've done a lot of polls on Twitter about how people feel about server components and Next.js, and if they want to use them or not, which framework they would use. And for the most part, the conclusion that I've come to is that there are a lot of people coming into Next.js who are using server components just because that is the happy path that they have designed for Next.js.
It's also the default. Unless you put in use client, it's a server component.
Yeah. And for me, it's not interesting for me personally. Many, if not almost all of the apps that I've ever built, I don't know if they would really directly benefit from from the capabilities of server components at this time. I mean, yes, they could benefit in terms of some bundle size, but the trade-offs for me just are not worth it. One, I don't want to have to reason about this new mental model of, interweaving client and server components almost at every level of the component tree just to get, trade-offs that don't matter for me or really won't matter much for my users at this point.
By the way, I'm going to interrupt because I think I always like to give a bit more context to our listeners. So
Sure.
first of all, we had 2 episodes with Dan Abramov and Joe Savona talking about server components. So if anybody's really interested in the nitty-gritty of what they are, I highly recommend listening to those episodes. They were excellent. The key aspect about server components is that they are components that only run on the server versus client components which can run both on the client and on the server, which is an interesting.
I'm even going to extend that to say that server components have the worst name ever. They should not be called server components. They should be called like static components or serializable JSX.
Server only components, maybe?
I mean, because you can technically generate server components at build time too, at bundle time. Really all it is you're just pre-rendering a component and producing this output that is like stringified JSX. And then you're shipping that to the client from either the static build or dynamically from the server during runtime. And then you're rendering that JSX stringified version. You're turning that into something you can render.
I prefer to think about it as serialized virtual DOM.
Exactly what it is. It's serialized virtual DOM. And when you talk about it like that, it becomes much easier to reason about what you would actually gain from using them. Which for me, out of the box, the things that I think are interesting about server components is that you could import and render and do a lot of complex work with using really large bundles and libraries on the back end that produce a really small JSX output. And you would only have to ship that to the client. And that's something that actually is very useful, thinking about it from that way. And that's something where like it would be useful for like Meta, that's the whole reason they built Relay, and the ability for Relay to send components down in chunks with certain GraphQL responses was so that they could only send down the code that they needed to render the thing at that exact moment. So it's very much like the next generation of that idea, even though Meta's not using it, which is another topic. But this is the next generation of that idea, is only sending the code that's needed to run on the client to produce that thing. It doesn't really have a whole lot to do with data loading other than you can load the data on the server and then produce the HTML on the server and send that HTML down to the client. So it's very much like using a traditional rendering framework from like old backend days. You produce the HTML, I'm air quoting here, but it's JSX, and you ship that down to the user instead of having to ship all of your data fetching logic and your rendering logic down to the client.
So does TanStack actually support server components, or do you solely rely on server functions?
I will support them. So I've actually written all the code to proof of concept this out. It works. We're going to support them in a very safe way. I can go into depth, and actually I think it's worth talking about that. So server components, people look at server components through the lens of Next.js right now because that's the only thing that we know. And
it's the only implementation, I think.
Yeah. Next.js, their entire router, like the entire experience from the root of the application down, is a large server component, essentially. It starts at the root, and it starts on the server, and it interweaves between client and server going all the way down. That has kind of skewed the way that people look at server components. I think they think that that's the only way that it can happen, and that all of their routing files and their layout files and all these other things are going to be written in this like use server, use client kind of handoff, thinking about these rules. Well, similar to, so if you caught Next.js Conf this last year, Ryan Florence, they demoed how it could be different. And it almost aligns exactly with how I was thinking about them as well, is that server components are really just another form of asynchronous state or data that you're getting from an API endpoint or some embedded static data that you have in your application. And so really it can happen at network IO boundaries. Next.js has those built into the entire system. So it's just kind of, that's just what's happening all the time. But for TanStack Start, the way that we're going to do it is if you want to use a server component, you simply return JSX or React in a server function, in an RPC.
I felt that was where you were going.
That's it. And, you know, that fits right in with Remix too, because so they don't really have RPCs, but they do have loaders, which is kind of like their hard-coded REST, their kind of REST flavor of an RPC, right? And they're doing the same thing. It's just you just return JavaScript, or you just return React and JSX inside of a loader. So server functions are really going to be the place where you can use server.
So a question about that. So first of all, it seems kind of almost like you might be returning a string and then injecting it using what's it called, unsafe, dangerously unsafe insert HTML or whatever.
A little bit.
But the question that I have about that, what prevents that server function from returning JSX or virtual DOM that the client doesn't know what to do with, like using components that don't exist or whatever?
A lot of that just comes down to how it gets bundled. So the real feature, if you ever listen to Andrew from the React core team, is it Andrew Clark? I think it's his name, right? Andrew?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I like the way Andrew talks about it. He says the real feature of server components is not a framework feature. It's a bundler. It's a bundler feature. And it allows you to basically render a component and only bundle up the things that it needs to render with it. And so when you serialize that component, everything that ran on the server is going to turn into JSX markup that's right there in that representation. And everything that can't run on the server that needs to run on the client is referenced through a manifest. And it gets a little tricky with how that works, but that manifest is just a mapping of client component references that can come down through server components to the actual modules and bundler modules that it can go out and grab if it needs to grab them. So when you render something on the server, it comes down with this response that says, here's all this server function or the server component markup, and there might be some client components in there. And if they're already loaded into your app on the client, then they'll just render. And if they're not, then they will suspend while they go and pull that client side bundle chunk that they need to render, and then they will finally render.
So a key difference, it seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, between the Next.js way and your approach is that with Next.js, the root is, like you said, a server component, whereas in your case, the root is a quote-unquote client component, even though it actually might run on the server.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. Is that with Next.js, everything's going to be server first all the time, no matter what.
Well, Vercel.
Right, of course. And then with TanStack Start, even down to the way that the APIs are designed, everything's written to be isomorphic first. So if you don't do anything inside of a server function, what you write is just going to happen during SSR, and it's going to happen on the client. Um,
You know what I really like about your approach now that I'm thinking about it? So I have this presentation, this talk that I gave about different ways to overcome the cost of hydration, the performance cost of hydration. And I show the different ways, and I for each such method, I list something like 6 or 7 approaches, and for each one of them I give both the upsides and the downsides of each approach. And one of the approaches that I mentioned towards the end are server components. And one of the downside of server components that I presented in my talk is that they require you to basically re-architect your application. You
yes, they
can't
do.
take an existing application and just throw in server components into it. You need to rethink your entire architecture. You need to learn this new not even new technology, but new approach, and then architect your application accordingly. And what
Well,
I really like, sorry, go on, please
I
do.
was going to say I agree, but I think there's some nuance there where with server components you can migrate incrementally, but you have to do it from the top down. You have to slowly move the server bound. So at the top, if you just say I want to render my whole app as a client component, you can do that. In Next.js, you can even do that. I hope, but you can render your entire app as a client component. It'll
Well, you can
ship
have a
everything.
really thin server component that basically just
Right.
renders your.
Right. And the migration path is to slowly push that server boundary down through your component structure as far down as you can. That's the incremental migration strategy. And I don't like doing refactors from the root down. In fact, I like doing my leaf node up.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. But if you basically do that, then you've not. Again, my presentation was in the context of improving the reducing the cost of hydration, and if
Yeah,
you just do that, you basically have not reduced the cost of hydration at all. And in
slowly
order
you
to
would.
reduce, yeah, slowly, but all it means is that you've slowly re-architected your application.
Exactly.
Um, and what I like about your approach, it seems to me, is that you can get this value without re-architecting your application. You want to, you think you have some component somewhere in the tree that could benefit from being a server rendered component because I don't know, it uses some date and time functionality that would require you to download Moment.js. Well, you just turn that into a server function that returns JSX.
Yeah. And you bring up you brought a cool thought into my head is that talking about refactoring, right? Let's imagine a lot of people are on Create React App. At the very least, it's not too difficult to get into Vite. At the very least, just saying, hey, I want to use Vite. But to be able to use, what would it take for somebody at that point then to use server components, right? Telling them that they would need to adopt an entirely new framework is a big pill to swallow if they just want to consume this new server component pattern, this new technology. It's a hard pill for them to swallow, and I would wager that a lot of people wouldn't do that. But what if you could say, hey, all you need to do is just get off of Create React App, which you should do anyway, get into Vite, right? All you need to do is get into Vite. And if you can do that, we can give you a Vite plugin that will let you call server functions and then let you return server components. And then you can just render those server components without refactoring really any other part of your application. Even if you're still using React Router version 4 or 5, you could still make an API call using whatever you want, using React Query even, and call into a server function, get back a server component, and render it. You would just need to migrate to Vite and be using React 19. So that's probably the path of least resistance. If you just want to get your hands on server components, that's the path of least resistance that I'm trying to make possible. So I know I said that Start is 90% router. That's if you're consuming the whole framework. But really at the end of the day, what Start is just the ability to do SSR if you want and server functions. That's really
I love that. And by the way, I told Dan Abramov when he was on the show that because they were getting huge pushback against React server components, and I know that it the React team got a lot of pushback that they weren't used to get. Let's put it this way: they were always the last time they got such pushback from the community was, I think, more or less when they introduced JSX.
Yeah.
Um, and and they had hoped that the reaction would have been similar to the reaction that they got when they introduced hooks, which were
Yeah.
really quickly adopted by the
Great.
community.
Yeah.
And the key difference was that hooks, you could basically take it or leave it. You could use it on a per component basis. So when you could take an existing React application and decide that I'm not going to touch any of the existing code,
Yeah.
but new components that I'm adding would use hooks, and everything would just work.
And it
And
didn't
that's the
require an
what
architectural overhaul.
exactly. It was at the component level. And if you can do that for React server components, that would be amazing, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
It's fine that it requires an architectural overhaul. It's going to require something. If it involves a server, you're going to have to do something architecturally. I just think that rolling up that architecture change into, hey, you have to adopt this entirely new framework. That's a hard pill to swallow. And that's both Next.js is in, and I think React Router's hope is that, hey, just buy into our router and we'll take care of the rest, right? And unfortunately for me, that's an even harder pill for me to swallow, is because I don't really like the routers that I see out there. I don't like Next.js's router, and I moderately enjoy React Router, but it lacks a lot of things for me. I'm definitely not happy using it anymore. And so knowing that other people are going to have to make that same sacrifice to say, oh yes, I have to buy into Next.js, all of it, or I have to buy into React Router at least if I want to get on a path to use these latest React features. That's not something that I want to have to do even myself, and I don't want to have to make other people do that as well. So I'm trying my hardest to build Start in a way that can be consumed without having to just turn your entire application upside down. There's always going to be a little bit of buy-in. You have to buy into Vite. You're going to have to buy into servers in general. Like, I hope your company lets you run server code, because a lot of front-end devs are not allowed to provision servers. So
Yeah, I'll put it this way: a while, not so long ago, I was interviewing at a couple of companies, and I was interviewing at a senior technical rank. So one of the things that I was looking at during the interview process was actually the technologies and architectures that they were using for the front end. And what I saw is that all of them were using React, and almost none of them was using SSR or any other and consequently any meta framework. And if you could provide the ability for such companies to start leveraging the benefits of React on the server side in a way that does not disrupt their existing architecture and their existing code base, that's a huge benefit.
yeah, I agree. And I came from that world where, like, I wasn't going to start, even on my small team, I didn't want to have to provision servers. My team, we had our APIs written in a different language, distributed through very different means. Like, I wasn't going to touch server code anytime soon. I mean, a lot of very successful applications and enterprise companies, like, to even think about, oh yeah, our front end developers are going to start running server side code, is a big leap, because just the way that APIs need to scale, they get their own teams, they turn into different languages. I just think that there's so many more benefits that we should be looking to give front end developers right now who work on these kinds of applications and large enterprise applications, who, so many of them won't even be able to touch server components until their company finally decides years from now to let them run server-side code. So yes, I'm excited about, the server, and I'm trying to go down that path as much as I can, but I'm still so heavily invested in the client-side tooling space. I think Query has been phenomenal for the industry. I think Table is great. I think TanStack Router is still the most underrated part of what I'm building, because if you're a client-side application and you're going to stay a client-side application, I really don't understand why you would even consider using Next.js or React Router at this point. There's just if you're questioning that, then you should DM me and I'll talk to you about it. Because I built TanStack Router for enterprise routing use cases, and it truly shines. So yeah, those in that part of our industry is very underrepresented and soft spoken, especially on places like social media and Twitter. There's very, very big successful applications being maintained by very smart people that we never hear from on Twitter or X or anywhere like that. So I know they exist though. I talk to them offline. I talk to them in DMs, and I'm trying to represent them as well.
Oh, for sure.
Hey, Dan, well, we need to get wrapped up here because it's been a long time here. So let's do some last words from both you guys, and then we'll move on to picks.
Now, one thing that I wanted to talk about, but I don't think we have time, so we can do it in some future time, is but like some of the downsides of RPCs that existed again way back in the 90s. RPCs, for example, tended to be chatty protocols. They also tended to introduce a lot of endpoints and generally introduce various maintenance issues. But I don't think we really have time to delve into this time. So maybe we should bring you on to talk about RPC in depth sometime.
I can give you a 30-second teaser on that if you want. I
Go for it.
think that there's some chattiness that can happen, but I think if you are using them for your actual source of truth on full stack stuff, there are some interesting things there, like actually building full stack APIs. But if you're just using them to then, do secure things on the server that communicate externally with your other API or backend, I think that some of that chattiness can be justified. And then also there's fun things about server functions that we didn't even get to talk about. But we've added validation to our server function strategies. We've added type safe middleware to our server functions, which is very, very powerful, where you can wrap up client side and server side transactions through server functions and do really, really cool things. And then also being able to do public RPCs in the future is something that we're considering. So once you've written an RPC in TanStack, the only thing keeping it from becoming a fully blown REST like HTTP endpoint that's public is just supplying a path, a static path. So we're considering allowing people to even build public REST endpoints, like static paths that they'll be able to use, not just in their application side by side as an RPC, but even call into with, say, an RPC client that's generated for their React Native app or for a bunch of different projects, and kind of create some tooling around that.
You know what would be awesome? If we brought both you and Ryan on the show to talk about RPCs. I think that would be amazing.
Anytime you get me and Ryan together, it's going to be a party. So I would love to come on with Ryan.
Okay. Ryan's
right.
a friend. I'll try to organize it.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Tanner. If you want to learn more about TanStack, tanstack.com is the place to go. Docs and demos and all kinds of goodies. So with that, we'll move on to picks. Picks are the part of the show where we get to talk about things that we want to talk about that maybe aren't tech related. Could be. Let's see. AJ, you've been quiet. What do you got for us for picks?
So I was looking for something to play. I was in a video game mood, and I was very, very kind of disheartened that a lot of the games I really loved as a kid, they have not been recreated in a similar form, like GoldenEye. I figured there's got to be something like GoldenEye, but there aren't really any other games other than GoldenEye and Perfect Dark where you sneak around and assassinate people through a maze to accomplish some goal. And I ended up trying out something new. I've never even heard of the genre of 4X, but it's explore, extend, exploit, extinguish, something like that. It's like the Microsoft strategy, but
That's what I
applied
was going
to
to say. It sounds like Microsoft.
yeah. So Civilization 6 is kind of like Age of Empires or Command and Conquer mixed with Sim City. And it is heavily discounted right now because Civilization 7 is about to come out. And so for all the different platforms for Nintendo Switch, you can check on gg.deals, GG as in good game, gg.deals, or decudeals.com, deku as in Deku Tree. And you can get either the premium package or just the base game for $2, $3, $4, $5. And it's my warning is that it's addictive. If you have an addictive personality, if you like things where you have to min max and strategize to figure out the best route, it's every time you play the game, the map is randomized, and but you have a civilization that has certain benefits, like what it can build early or whatever, and you get a couple hours into the game, and then you're past, or I guess past, you you get into your next age, and new things unlock, and you have other civilizations on the board. It's also kind of like Risk, and that there's different civilizations on the board, and you're trying to basically gather more land before they do, and amass more points to some goal.
AJ, I'm looking at the GG Deals page right now, and they're selling them for under $3.
Yeah. So
It's a 95% discount for the next
my
4 days.
one caution would be don't buy it for Mac, because
Why?
after I got it for Switch, I also got it for Mac. Basically, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The game opens, it crashes. If you can keep it open long enough, you can't move it from one monitor to another. All of the key bindings are Windows key bindings, like with numpad and F6 and all that sort of stuff. You can change those key bindings, of course, but my assumption is that they never tested it on Mac whatsoever, that they use some sort of framework that allows it to compile on different operating systems, and they just hit the compile button and they said, oh, the Mac build finished, okay, put up the digital code. But I don't think any of the developers of the game have ever tested it on a Mac. And if you look at any of the reviews that are 1-star reviews, they're all mentioning Mac. It doesn't run on Mac. It doesn't actually, like, it will install, it will open, you can click 2 or 3 buttons, and then it crashes. So don't do that.
So you're basically saying if you've got a computer at home, get it for a PC, not for a Mac.
Yeah, I might even run on Linux. I don't remember if that was on there, but yeah, Windows or Xbox or PlayStation. The consoles are good because Microsoft and Nintendo and Sony will rip you a new one if your game just crashes when you start it. Whereas Steam doesn't care. Steam's like, oh, the game just crashes when you start it. Contact the publisher. We don't care. We just take the money. So
Alrighty.
anyway, that's my one thing.
Thank you. Dan, you got any picks for us?
Yeah, not a
Hey,
lot.
I have a hard stop right now, and I don't
Oh.
have any picks, so I'd be happy to do my sign off, but I got to run.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming, Tanner.
Thanks, guys, for having me. I do want to come back on and talk about server stuff with Ryan Carniato, so let me know when you want to do
I'll
that.
make sure to organize that. Now you've
All right.
given me extra incentive. That would be so awesome.
Cool. Thank
I'll
you so
definitely do
much.
it. Thank
AJ,
you.
Dan,
It
Steve,
was,
good to see you
it was
guys.
awesome. Thank you
We'll
very
catch
much.
you again soon. Bye.
Okay, so talking about one thing. Oh, he left. Hopefully he'll let the thing finish uploading. Anyway, so my pick is I've been an Anthony Jeselnik fan for a long time. You guys know who he is? He's like this edgy stand-up comic, and I really have enjoyed his material over the years. we even had this one really pleasant surprise where when we went to this stand-up club in LA, and he made a surprise appearance there to try out new stuff, new material. So that was really awesome. And I really loved his shows that he did in the past, Thoughts and Prayers and Fire in the Maternity Ward. And now he's recently come out with a new show called Bones and All, and it's okay. I watched it and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't as good as his old shows. So if you're an Anthony Jeselnik fan and you haven't watched it yet, you should, but don't expect it to be as great as as his past stuff. I don't know why. That's just my take on it. But anyway, that would be my pick for today.
Alrighty, I will go last here since my picks are always the high point. First pick is a reference to something that Tanner said during when he was talking earlier, and he talked about how we got nerd sniped. Reminds me of one of my favorite XKCD cartoons called Nerd Sniping. It's number 356. So considering where things are right now, it's a very early one. And it's called Nerd Sniping, and it describes it perfectly. Makes me laugh every time I read this cartoon. But go check it out. Nerds XKCD number 356. And for the dad jokes of the week, it's been a while, so I have a plethora to choose from. The other day I was talking to a friend of mine, and I told him, hey, I took my wife to the Caribbean last month. And he said, Jamaica? I said, no, she wanted to go. Also, did you know that you're actually born with 4 kidneys? When you grow up, 2 of them become adult knees. And finally, it really annoys me when people get well-known phrases wrong. I mean, seriously, it's not like it's rocket surgery. Anyway, those are the dad jokes of the week. We'll say thanks to Tanner for coming on and talking about TanStack. Sounds like we're going to get another episode scheduled with him and Ryan Carniato. Courtesy
I
of Dan.
really hope so. I can only promise to do my best.
Dan has connections everywhere, man. If we want to get somebody on, just talk to Dan. He knows them all. Thanks, guys, for coming on. Thanks to Tanner for coming on, and we'll talk with you all next time on JavaScript Jabber.
Bye.
Adios.